The fog rolled in before dawn on March 31st, 2026. And somewhere inside that fog, 16 Russian motorized units were moving. Quietly, confidently. They believed the weather was hiding them. It wasn't. Ukrainian thermal sensors had already locked onto every single vehicle, every soldier, every step. And as those Russian columns pushed deeper into the open terrain north of Donetsk, the trap was already closing around them. What happened next would become one of the most devastating single-month performances by any military unit in this entire war. 3,110 Russian soldiers taken out of action, 9 settlements liberated. Russia's entire spring 2026 offensive, the one the Kremlin had been planning for months, was dead before it even began. And it was killed by one Ukrainian corps. Stay with me, because the full picture of what these units actually did in March and how they did it is something that even most close watchers of this war haven't fully seen yet. The drone trap alone will change how you understand this conflict. Let's go back to where it started. The Kremlin's plan was built on a simple domino theory. A powerful mechanized push through Pokrovsk would trigger a cascade. Sloviansk would fall next. And once Sloviansk was gone, the road to Kramatorsk would open. Kramatorsk falls, and the last defensive strongholds of Donetsk are exposed. The entire Eastern Front collapses. On paper, it was a credible plan. Russia had concentrated enormous firepower in this sector. Motorized rifle divisions, elite Spetsnaz units, drone operators from the 57th Spetsnaz Battalion, reconnaissance teams, remote-controlled mine units. They were not sending a probing force. They were sending everything. The Kremlin believed that by spring 2026, this would all be over. That belief was about to collide with the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps. Let's start from March 27th, because that day reveals something critical about how Ukrainian paratroopers actually fight. They don't just defend, they strangle. On the 27th, the Corps was not holding a line. It was systematically cutting the T-0515 highway, the main logistics artery feeding Russian forces in the sector, using precision drone strikes. Think about what that means tactically. An army at the front cannot fight if it cannot resupply. Ammunition convoys were being targeted and destroyed before they reached the forward units. Reserve forces were being hit on the road before they could reinforce the front line. Soldiers at the front were already running low on food and water, and now their resupply was being vaporized from the air. Ukraine didn't just hold the line on March 27th. It began slowly suffocating the Russian force that would try to attack it in the coming days. This matters, because when the attacks finally came, they came from soldiers who were already hungry, already short on ammunition, and already losing confidence in the structure around them. March 28th brought a different kind of danger. The Russians changed tactics. Instead of a single frontal push, they deployed what's called the pincer maneuver, simultaneous assaults from 2 directions at once, from the Koshchevat and Razdalivka directions, hoping to split Ukrainian attention and create a gap in the defensive line. The weather helped them. Poor visibility made drone reconnaissance difficult. This was Russia's best window of the week. But the Ukrainian airborne forces adapted in real time. They switched from optical drone feeds to thermal imaging and acoustic sensors, technology that sees heat signatures and detects sound even when visibility is 0. The enemy can hide from cameras. They cannot hide from heat. Street-by-street fighting broke out. An infiltration attempt on the eastern flank was detected and blocked. Despite the conditions, despite the dual-pronged pressure, Ukrainian paratroopers held every position. The Russians gained nothing. March 30th. One more attempt, one more failure. But this one tells us something important about how desperate the Russian tactical thinking had become. This time, motorized infantry supported by ATVs, motorcycles, and light vehicles tried to bypass the main Ukrainian positions entirely. The idea was to go around, not through, to find a gap in the flanks using speed and small unit mobility. The 7th Corps stopped them again. Drone and artillery coordination worked in concert. Drone spotting, artillery striking, FPV drones finishing what artillery started. Burning Russian vehicles were scattered across open ground. Footage from that day spread across Telegram within hours. 3 straight days of failed attacks. And now comes the one that defined the entire month. March 31st, 2026. The fog came back, and this time, the Russians tried to use it for something far more ambitious than a standard assault. Units attached to the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade began a covert infiltration operation under the cover of the fog. They were accompanied by Spetsnaz drone operators. This was not a reconnaissance mission. The objective was to penetrate deep into Ukrainian positions, reach the center of Kursk, seize control of the road leading to Pokrovsk, and collapse the entire Donetsk defense line from the inside out. It was an audacious plan. If it had worked, it would have been a turning point in the war. It didn't work, because the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps had already seen them. Ukrainian paratrooper drones were cutting through the fog using thermal sensors. Every Russian unit's position was marked. Their advance speed was calculated. The exact moment they would be most exposed, in open terrain, mid-movement, spread out, was predicted down to the minute. And then fire rained down. Artillery and FPV drones struck simultaneously. A Russian company commander was eliminated in the first wave. That single casualty broke something. The chain of command shattered. Soldiers who had been short on food and water for days suddenly had no one to give them orders. Some tried to press forward. The drones hunted them. Others tried to retreat. Artillery had already cut off the escape routes. Not a single Russian soldier entered the center of Kursk. On that same day, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, 29 separate Russian attacks in the direction of Pokrovsk were repelled. Russian offensives collapsed across every sector, from Ternivka to Myrnohrad, from Rodinsk to Andrivka. 29 attacks, all repelled. In one day? Now let's zoom out and look at what the entire month of March actually cost Russia. 3,110 soldiers taken out of action by a single corps in 31 days. Let that sit for a moment. To put it in historical context, Russia's total military losses in the entire 9-year Soviet-Afghan war were approximately 15,000 soldiers. This one Ukrainian corps, defending one section of the Donetsk front, inflicted 1/5 of that total in a single month. On average, 100 Russian soldiers were taken out of action every single day. The equipment losses were equally staggering. 6,989 unmanned aerial vehicles destroyed. 66 artillery systems eliminated. 3 tanks, 6 armored vehicles, and 170 motorcycles and ATVs reduced to wreckage. These numbers don't happen by accident. They are the product of a military unit that has perfected a specific style of warfare: defend, absorb, counterattack, advance, and executes it with a level of precision that has no equivalent on the Russian side of this conflict. To understand why, you need to understand what the Ukrainian airborne forces actually are. The 7th Rapid Reaction Corps is the center of gravity. It includes the 81st, 82nd, and 95th Brigades, supported by the 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion. These are not conventional defensive infantry units. They are trained to do something far more difficult: hold a line under pressure and immediately transition into offensive operations the moment the enemy shows weakness. Defend, counterattack, advance, all as one fluid motion. And now let's look at what the 81st Brigade specifically did, because this is where the fog trap becomes most vivid. The 81st Separate Slovianska Airborne Brigade is defending the Sloviansk sector. This is the most strategically critical line north of Donetsk. If Russia captures this ground, Kramatorsk is directly exposed. If Kramatorsk falls, the last organized defensive structures in Donetsk begin to unravel. Russia understood this, which is exactly why they sent their largest motorized assault of 2026 directly at the 81st Brigade's positions on March 31st, 16 motorized units, moving in groups of 3 to 4 vehicles each. Their plan: break through Ukrainian lines, engage in close-quarters combat, control key logistics routes using remote-controlled mines and aerial drones. Here is what actually happened. The 81st Brigade had spent months engineering this battlefield. Drone detection networks, minefields with pre-calculated fire zones, artillery positioned to cover every axis of approach. When those 16 Russian motorized units rolled into the open, they were not entering a battle. They were entering a kill box that had been built specifically for them. FPV drones and artillery struck immediately. Ambush and close-quarters defense tactics were executed simultaneously. All enemy infantry were neutralized. The convoy was destroyed. Sloviansk did not fall. Kramatorsk remains in Ukrainian hands today. But the contribution of the airborne forces in March extended beyond Pokrovsk and Sloviansk. In the Oleksandrivka direction, further south, these units went on offense. The 95th Airborne Assault Brigade broke through Russian defensive lines and liberated 9 settlements. Colonel Kleopas, commanding the 95th, described what his forces encountered. The Russians had constructed an extensive system of trenches, bunkers, and reinforced shelters, a defensive network that would normally take weeks to crack. The Ukrainians cracked it in days. The method was direct. Drone units struck first, catching Russian defenders off guard before they could organize. Assault groups then moved so fast that Russian reserve forces couldn't be deployed in time. When those reserves finally arrived, coming in small groups, in motorcycles and light vehicles, Ukrainian forces detected them on the road and destroyed them before they could reach the front. Since mid-January 2026, over 400 square kilometers of territory have been recaptured in the Oleksandrivka and Yuliivka directions. This is Ukraine's largest ground gain since 2023. Russia's southward advance, the advance Putin had planned to use as the launch point for his spring-summer offensive, has been reversed entirely. The launch pads were taken directly from his hands. Now I want to show you something about Russia's army that explains why these losses compound so quickly. Because what's happening on the front lines is not just a military failure. It is a structural collapse. An investigation by The Economist interviewed dozens of Russian contract soldiers currently serving in Belgorod, Luhansk, and Donetsk. What they described is not a military chain of command. It is an extortion network. Everything at the front has a price. Drones, medals, days away from the front line, transferred to safer positions, even survival itself. Maxim, 26 years old, was recruited with a signing bonus of 2.5 million rubles. He was sent to Luhansk without a single day of military training. Of the total 8 million rubles he received across his contract, 6 million went to equipment purchases and bribes to commanders. He paid 1 million rubles just to be transferred away from the front line. And after that, he continued paying between 100,000 and 150,000 rubles every month to stay there. The first words his commanding officer said when they met were, "I've buried 12 battalions. You're the 13th. And then, the next day, the real message: survival is not about skill or luck. It is about financial resources. Another soldier, Anton, described the system in even starker terms. It begins with a request, money for drones, for food, for supplies. But once you make the first payment, you never stop. You keep paying so they don't send you to the front. Ukraine's drone operations have created what soldiers on both sides now describe as a death zone at least 20 kilometers deep behind Russian front lines. Moving in this zone, in a vehicle, on a motorcycle, on foot, is potentially fatal. This has created a grotesque economy. Some commanders collect soldiers' bank cards and PIN codes before sending them into assault operations. When those soldiers die, they are declared missing rather than killed in action, which means the commanders can quietly withdraw money from their accounts at ATMs in Donetsk and Luhansk for weeks or months afterward. The independent Russian outlet Mediazona has verified the identities of at least 100 commanders who ordered or carried out exactly these kinds of actions. This is what Ukraine's paratroopers are destroying when they destroy a Russian assault column. They are not just destroying vehicles and personnel. They are grinding down a system that is already eating itself alive. And the numbers at the national level confirm the trajectory. President Zelensky disclosed on April 1st that Russia had failed to reach its military objectives in 3 separate sectors simultaneously. Russian offensive operations were intensifying, but each new wave was producing higher losses while making less progress. Russia had planned to mobilize 409,000 personnel by the end of 2026. As of the end of March, it had reached only 20 to 22% of that target. The mobilization rate has fallen behind the casualty rate. To compensate, the Kremlin has pushed regional signing bonuses as high as 3.6 million rubles in some areas, then quietly cut those bonuses back to 400,000 rubles when the cost became unsustainable. Over 18,000 foreign fighters from 128 countries have been brought in to fill the gaps. Prisoners have been conscripted, and according to Mediazona's analysis, the most common age of death among Russian contract volunteers in 2025 was between 46 and 52 years old. The pool of young, capable volunteers has been exhausted. What remains is older, less trained, and sent into combat against units like the 7th Rapid Reaction Corps. Since the start of 2026, Russia has lost 89,000 military personnel. That figure already far exceeds Russia's total mobilization for the same period. In the skies, the picture is equally stark. In March, Ukraine's air defense intercepted 89.9% of all Russian missiles and drones. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has cited the integration of new systems and the modernization of existing platforms. Their stated target is 95% interception. They are approaching it. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone operations struck Russia's own energy infrastructure. The port of Luga and the Kinef refinery in Leningrad Oblast both sustained significant damage. Russia's daily oil export flow, 1.75 million barrels, has decreased. This is no longer just a battlefield war. It is an economic war, and Ukraine is fighting it on every dimension simultaneously. Ukrainian combat drones, according to Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, increased both the number of sorties and the percentage of Russian targets destroyed by 55% in March compared to February. Every single month, Ukraine's drone capability is becoming more lethal. Go back, now, to that foggy morning on March 31st. A Russian company commander steps into open terrain, flanked by Spetsnaz operators, believing the fog is his shield. He does not know that Ukrainian thermal sensors have already traced his outline. He does not know that artillery coordinates have already been calculated for the exact ground beneath his feet. He does not know that the order to fire is already waiting for the right moment. He dies, and his death triggers a cascade. His soldiers, hungry and under-equipped after days of supply disruptions caused by Ukrainian drone strikes on the T-0515 highway 4 days earlier, receive no orders. Some push forward into drones. Some retreat into artillery. None reach their objective. This is not luck. This is not a single heroic stand. This is the product of months of preparation, deliberate logistics warfare, precision engineering of the battlefield, and units that have learned to think 3 moves ahead. Russia's strategy in Donetsk was built on the idea that enough pressure applied in enough places would eventually break the Ukrainian line. What March 2026 demonstrated is that the Ukrainian airborne forces have found a way to make every Russian attack more expensive than the one before it. Not just in personnel and equipment, in organization, in morale, in the will to keep sending men into a system that cannot protect them. Attrition wars are not lost when one side runs out of soldiers. They are lost when the cost of replacing those soldiers becomes politically, economically, and morally unsustainable. Russia has not reached that point yet, but March showed, with brutal clarity, that it is moving toward it, and Ukraine's paratroopers are moving faster. The front line is shifting, quietly but unmistakably. And what happens here, in these fields, in this fog, in this grinding daily calculus of drones and artillery and men, will determine not just the future of Ukraine. It will determine the security architecture of an entire continent. That is why March 2026 matters. And that is why these units matter.